Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Wednesday, May 7th, 2025, and on Wednesdays we talk about emotional well-being and relationships. So according to the late Richard Carlson, he wrote this book, You Can Be Happy No Matter What. And this is actually based on his final book that he wrote before his passing in 2006 titled 5 Principles for Keeping Life in Perspective. So personally, I was inspired originally by one of his earlier books in 1997, his New York Times bestseller, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and It's All Small Stuff. So the basic idea there is that most of what we tend to worry about and stress over all day long doesn't really matter all that much in the long run. And that can be quite the liberating realization if we truly take it to heart, and that can really help us relax. And so he has a number of different principles and anecdotes that he shares in that particular book, a few of which I'll just mention briefly here. So for example, Carlson stressed that you should make peace with imperfection. No perfectionist is ever going to achieve inner peace and have low anxiety. And I should know, because I used to be one myself. And so you need to let go of the need for things to be perfect. And that's partly why, for example, I don't really typically edit these vlogs or eliminate the glitches or try to make them just right. Believe me, there's a lot of editing that could be done. I'm sure you're quite well aware. But if I worried about being perfect all the time, then honestly, nothing would ever get posted. So just try to accept and love things as they are, perhaps starting with yourself more than anyone else, and always accept that things are never going to be completely perfect. And indeed, you can just accept and even to some degree relish in the notion that things are always going to be imperfect, and actually embrace the imperfection, if you will. Also, be aware of the snowball effect in your thinking. So one negative thought can easily lead to another and then another. And so catch yourself or tell yourself when that starts to happen, oh, here I go. I'm doing it again. No need to worry about that. That sort of thing. Mark Twain once said, I've been through some terrible things in my life, some of which actually happened. And so don't allow your brain then to dwell on the past or even worry then about what might happen in the future. So in other words, regret keeps us paralyzed by a past that's already been, while anxiety keeps us paralyzed by a future that has yet to arrive. So in that sense, we want to learn to live in the present moment as much as possible. Another principle that he talks about in Don't Sweat the Small Stuff is to allow or let go of the ego. Let go of your ego as much as possible, especially in terms of letting other people have the glory. Everyone wants to feel special and important from time to time. And when someone shares something that they've done, they're proud of something or they've accomplished something, it's important to allow them to enjoy that moment and to celebrate that moment with them. So in other words, don't water it down or interrupt or talk about yourself or share something wonderful that's happened to you. I mean, that might come up in the conversation as part of the natural ebb and flow. Don't immediately interject that into the conversation. So instead, let that person then have their glory. Rejoice with them and celebrate their success or good fortune. And again, at some point along the way, your time will come as well. And for that matter, I always recommend, too, taking a moment to learn something about the people whom you meet along the way. One thing that I've gotten pretty good at over the years is asking people about themselves and usually about their families, or depends on the context, something that's kind of important or significant. And then I try to commit to remembering what I've learned about them. Not just their name, maybe their birthday or some other important anecdote or story that they've told, something that allows me to connect or allows me to reconnect with that person perhaps down the road. And that's really important too to forging, I think, healthier relationships. It shows that you're genuinely interested in or concerned about or care about the other person. Just a brief caution in that regard. Don't expect that everyone can or will always reciprocate. So there's a lot of people that I've met over the years, especially just like neighbors or friends in some cases, where I know a lot more about them because I've asked about them. And yet they won't have necessarily reciprocated. So again, I try not to take that personally. That's just the way people are. But in terms of your own well-being and in terms of forging healthier relationships, if you're the person who can ask about others and then genuinely take an interest in them and what they're doing and their success or their good fortune, or in some cases to be empathetic and to be, sometimes a shoulder that they can lean on if necessary, then you're well on your way to becoming part of the solution, whatever that might look like. Also, ask yourself, will this matter a year from now? And in almost all cases, the answer to that question is no, or not really. And so try not to worry too much about the immediacy of events, even if they do seem a little bit more dramatic or a little bit more important. And don't misunderstand me. Sometimes there are key issues and events and happenings and so forth. But most instances, in most cases, they're not necessarily that crucial to your longer term or others' longer term well-being and happiness. So put things in perspective. Try not to worry. Try to focus on being more peaceful and loving yourself. And a key part of that too, and this is one that we all struggle with, I imagine, or most of us do, that is to accept that life isn't always fair. If you can accept this, then you're going to save yourself a tremendous amount of wasted energy in terms of frustration or even anger. Yes, sometimes good things happen to the people who are behaving badly that we don't admire, whatever the case. And sometimes, of course, bad things happen to the best people, even to ourselves. And that's just a natural part, of course, of the ebb and flow of life. So focus your energy then on creating the positive as much as possible. So there's a lot more that can be said, but I really love the straightforward language and the examples that Richard Carlson uses throughout that classic work, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. But then in his last work, You Can Be Happy No Matter What, Carlson explains that life is not your enemy, but your thinking can be. And that's the core idea of many philosophies, from the Stoics to Buddhism, to psychotherapists who specialize in, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. So put simply then, as thinking creatures, we often allow our thoughts to sabotage our own well-being. There are a range of unhealthy thought patterns that create unnecessary drama and trauma in our lives. And we're often our own worst enemy in that regard. For some people, there's a tendency to sort of believe in what I call the Lemony Snicket philosophy, that life's just a series of unfortunate events. I don't know if you're familiar with that children's series. We had a bunch of them, read a bunch of them with our kids when they were younger. But yeah, that is, a series of unfortunate events, and then occasionally interspersed with periods of happiness. But Richard Carlson thinks just the opposite. So in other words, in this particular book, You Can Be Happy No Matter What. Instead, he writes, our natural state of mind is one of contentment and joy. The barriers or obstructions that keep us from experiencing these positive feelings are learned negative processes that we have innocently come to accept as necessary or just the way life is, end quote. So you're born and created, in effect, to be happy, content, filled with inner peace and satisfaction and curiosity and affection. And feelings of gratitude, right, for those whom we love and are loved by, and so on. It's our most natural state. And in that natural state, you'll find yourself, and just looking at children, for example, laughing and playing and loving unencumbered by negative thoughts and anxieties. And yet, we often end up learning and acquiring behaviors and habits that hinder our chance at being truly happy. How so? Well, first, by convincing ourselves that life's a constant struggle and that we should be constantly aware of that struggle. And worst of all, there are some who've convinced themselves that we don't deserve to be happy. And that's a message, unfortunately, all too often reinforced by some of the significant others in our lives, and who may be some of the most toxic people, unfortunately, that we have to deal with. And it can even, of course, be our parents or the intimates in our lives. So to be happy in this life, then, you have to remove the obstructions and uncover the positive feelings that you're born with. That's your natural state. And again, this is what Carlson or anyone who works in the field would refer to as healthy psychological functioning. We know that permanent happiness cannot be generated from the outside, from external rewards as such, or from the others that we sort of sometimes give power to and claim that they are making us happy or miserable, or whatever we might be feeling. So, and that's where our minds come in to make such a huge difference. So the mind serves as both a storage vault for information and past experiences, but also as a transmitter for wisdom and common sense. And so the storage part of the computer part of the brain is used to analyze, compare, relate facts, make computations, and so on. But the other part, the transmitter that we each have access to, is a crucial part that deals with the matters of the heart, where the computer information is insufficient. And so it is our transmitter mind, not our computer mind, that is the source of our contentment and joy and wisdom. It's that connectedness, if you will, to our hearts. And you already sense the problem that's out there, right? It's virtually impossible to come up with the answers to life's biggest questions purely by using our computer minds. Because in cases that are truly important, if you're talking about, marriage or relationship problems or what have you, we don't have access or knowledge to all of the key information and variables at play. So we can't just metaphorically plug everything into our computers and spit out the optimal solution as such. And the computer in our brains tends to, that's a memory-based system, shall we say. And we do talk about memory of computers, so that's what we have in our brains as well. But the transmitter part of our brains is insight-based, okay? And so which will you use then to solve a particular problem? As Carlson explains, new answers don't come from what you already know in the computer part of the brain. They come from a change of heart, from seeing life differently, from the unknown, quieter parts of yourself. So then Carlson goes on to outline 5 general principles that underlie his broader philosophy on how we can always ensure, to some degree, that we are happy in this life, or that we can create in our brains or with our brains that sense of perpetual happiness. And I don't mean like in the non-thinking and purely emotional sense of euphoria, although that's great to have. Who doesn't enjoy that? But rather in terms of how do we maintain a state of general well-being and overall happiness no matter what? Okay, again, in general. Now, again, in the immediacy of a traumatic event, of course, you're not going to be happy. You're going to respond to that and have to process the information and adjust and go through all kinds of different feelings and responses. But just in terms of on a day in, day out basis, how then can we sort of program and reprogram ourselves to maintain this persistent sense of general well-being and happiness? And so he has chapters then devoted to these 5 different areas, all of which you know about, but it's just nice to put them together in kind of a formalized framework. But it starts with the thinking part of the brain. So according to Carlson, our ability to think creates our psychological experience of life, and thinking is a voluntary function, end quote. And most of our feelings, then positive or negative, are a direct consequence of our mode of thinking. And we produce and can change and reinterpret our experiences in different ways, and then create different feelings as a result. And this is a fundamental insight straight out of cognitive behavioral therapy. A second chapter is devoted to our moods. Our own understanding that our thinking is a voluntary function fluctuates from moment to moment and even from day to day. And these are the variances that we call our moods. Thomas Mann once wrote, "Time cools, time clarifies. No mood can be maintained quite unaltered through the course of hours." And so sometimes we're in high spirits. You can just enjoy life as it unfolds without thinking necessarily. And there are other times where you find yourself in low spirits. You find yourself subtly troubled. And the key, of course, is to understand that neither of these states is permanent as such. And so recognizing that neither state's permanent, the reasonable course of action would be to consider your lives, or to consider making important decisions or trying to find solutions when you're in relatively high spirits. That is, when problems seem less daunting and easier to solve or to resolve. And so in a high mood, relationships flow more easily, communications readily unfold. In low moods, life can look unbearably serious and difficult, even impossible at times. And this is true of everyone. We all have these different moods that shift from perhaps hour to hour or day to day. So that's something that we have to be aware of and try to track. And then again, in terms of our life decisions and moving forward, the best advice in this regard, or what Carlson's suggesting then, is that we should only act decisively when we're in high spirits or in that better mood, and try to, of course, mitigate and minimize the extent to which and the time that we spend in those low moods. And again, there might be a variety of healthy coping mechanisms that we can use to help ourselves deal with that. Okay, another aspect or another chapter is devoted to this idea of separate psychological realities. And that is, again, Carlson's talking about how we think in unique ways, each of us. And in that sense, we all live in separate realities too. And one of the keys to healthy relationships involves bridging that gap between ourselves. How do we connect? And we use that language all the time. Oh, I really connected with such and such. Or we really connected when we sat down and talked, or we went out on a date, or these sorts of things. And so two human beings obviously are connected at every level, and they're not the same in their interpretations. Because our brains are separate, we're going to interpret even the same events slightly differently, right? The Rashomon effect, it's called. Think about the old movie, or we talk about that sometimes in social science. So how everybody's perspective is slightly different, even though they're observing the exact same event. And so each person's mind and mode of thinking produces a unique frame of reference. And again, this means that there can be numerous interpretations of even the same event. And if you multiply that by all the people that you come in line with or come into contact with, you can appreciate then just how different people's worldviews can be. And so in most cases, the point here is that there's really no point in trying to change another person's mind, or wasting energy to try to get them to see through your eyes. Again, there can be some important exceptions, such as if the person's experiencing distorted worldviews, or they've lost connections with reality, or they've that is, those connections have been severely compromised because of addictions or abuse or trauma or what have you. But I'm just talking about in more kind of everyday situations. And we just have to appreciate and accept that as different people, we're going to have somewhat different interpretations of reality. And so again, unless somebody's experiencing a psychotic break, or somebody cannot help themselves but lie continuously, or unless their views are aimed at harming yourself or others, then it's really just a matter of allowing them the space and trying to understand, to the extent that we can, other people's experiences and their interpretations of what's happening. You don't even have to necessarily agree, but just being able to listen is a healthy response. I was driving somebody the other day. I won't give the details, and I remember thinking to myself, wow, this person is really vastly different than myself. But rather than allow that to trouble me or get upset or get frustrated or start to argue, which is, by the way, historically the way I've sort of been programmed to respond, I chose to allow them to speak their mind. And I did speak up at one point and offered a slightly different interpretation, shall we say. But for the most part, I allowed them to say their piece, to express their views. And I didn't waste my energy thinking, oh, well, I've got to change this person. I've got to inform them, etc. Now, again, if we were on a project together, if we had some shared interest, or, we had to work together, there may be times where we might have to interject a little bit more strongly, share our views. Usually it's more about sharing more information and also different ways of how we might possibly interpret or reinterpret that information. But all of this is to say, there's no point in getting upset just because somebody has a different view than you do or has a different interpretation of reality. Instead, we can just use this as an opportunity then to perhaps learn from them, again, sort of keep our own thoughts and feelings in check, listen to what it is that they're trying to communicate, and sometimes we can even learn something from the other person, even though we might still disagree with them at a fundamental level. So, and this is what important, healthy exchanges and learning to compromise is all about as well. Again, there are certain limits, there are certain exceptions. I've identified some of those a few minutes ago. Okay, and then he does a whole chapter on feelings, right? That is the importance of our emotions, which he argues serves as a built-in biofeedback mechanism that allows us to get a sense of whether or not we are functioning from a psychological standpoint in a healthy way. And he uses a quote from Sheila Crystal as the epigraph in this particular chapter. He says, "You're only one thought away from a good feeling." I love that little quote. So it's the essence of that perspective comes from Epicurus and his followers, who firmly believe that your feelings are an important indicator of how you think. Our feelings then tell us with a fairly high degree of accuracy when our thinking's functional or perhaps dysfunctional, if there's a gap. And so Carlson then provides a nice way of understanding this. So he uses the analogy. So, quote, when a warning light flashes in our car, he writes, then you have to consider not just why it's flashing, but that's not as crucial at first as the fact that it is flashing. And so then that indicates that you should turn off the road, get off the road and then turn off the motor. Fair enough. So, and in that sense, our worries about certain, our feelings that we have, like resentment or greed or depression or what have you, whatever you might associate with negative emotions or feelings, these are just signs. They're warning signs with respect to our psychological functioning. So if we're agitated in some way or another, in responding to someone or to a situation, then this tells us that we are having difficulty processing the information in a healthy way. Okay? And if you can't see what's wrong with it, if you're unable to come up with that or identify the problems that you're having and why you're feeling the way that you are, okay, then of course you may run out of gas, as they say, right? Or it may turn into something even more problematic or unhealthy, or, it might be too late then to fix the problem in some cases. Okay, you get the point. And then finally, the chapter looks at the present moment, since that's all we truly have, right? We need to focus our attention then more on the present, and this allows us then to lead our lives at peak capacity or functioning, and not be distracted by either the past, as I say, the regrets of the past or the anxieties of the future. So the present moment is then where we find our inner peace. Again, I can, just speaking for myself, I know that this has historically been a problem for myself. I've allowed myself to be burdened by negative thoughts of the past or anxieties anticipating what may happen or how things might unfold in the future. And this is, again, from a Buddhist perspective, from a Stoic's perspective, from a cognitive behavioral perspective, that's problematic. So our challenge then is to learn to live in the present. And Carlson, in fact, cites or he writes that almost every spiritual teacher throughout history has gravitated to this solution. In fact, this may be the oldest and wisest piece of information or advice for living a happier life. So in other words, that is our ability to truly embrace and live in the moment. Everything else, in some senses, is just an illusion, even the past in some respects. And so the point is, if you allow your mind then to wander too often, you will entrap yourself with these illusions. And instead, a mind that allows yourself to focus on the present is perfectly adapted then, or prepared to enjoy life as it unfolds, to experience contentment and satisfaction and happiness. Again, to sort of get back to its natural state of existence. Now again, all of this is to say, not to say that we shouldn't think about what else we can do in our lives to create the optimal conditions for happiness. And that typically includes the habits that we form, not just our thinking, but our broader daily behavioral habits, from sleep patterns to consuming healthy foods as part of our diet, to exercise, to just our normative patterns of interacting with others and the things that we do for ourselves and for others. So all of these behavioral aspects of our daily lives are crucial. And then, of course, that's also set within the broader context of our social networks and relationships. And so obviously in that sense, it's if we can surround ourselves by healthier people, all the better. On the other end of the spectrum, if we find ourselves immersed in toxic relationships or even a single toxic relationship, that can make things incredibly challenging with respect to maintaining that sense of well-being and happiness. Again, much more to say about that or these issues on other days and in other vlogs. But I guess the point is, from Carlson's perspective, and the point of this vlog is, start with your mind at the very least. That's the one thing you clearly have the most control over. It's the one area in your life where you can exercise, at least in principle, the greatest degree of control. And then hopefully you can use that mind to create healthier habits and patterns and eventually establish healthier relationships that are mutually reinforcing and so forth. But again, the point of today's vlog is to start with the mind and to sort of start rethinking, reconfiguring how we approach our minds and use our minds in healthier ways, and to create a healthier states of being, shall we say. Well, okay, that's it for today. Until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. And give yourself a hug today as well. Hope to see you soon, or maybe even tomorrow. Take care.